Congressman Waxman, it's a real privilege to have you here to talk about your extraordinary career and the impact you've had on environmental issues across the world. What I plan to do is to briefly summarize your extraordinary career and then ask you some questions about both your career and also to ask you the impact some of that will have in the future. So that we can gain from your leadership experience and help and use that to guide us in the future. You were born in 1939 in Los Angeles. All of your grandparents were Jewish immigrants from Russia. You earned a bachelor's degree in political science from UCLA and a JD from the UCLA Law School in 1964. After graduating, you worked for several different years, but then you were elected to the California Assembly, where you served ultimately in leadership positions for 3 terms. You were elected to the House of Representatives in 1974, and you have served for 40 years. During your tenure in the House, you have held significant leadership positions in several critical committees and subcommittees. From 1979 to 1994, you chaired the Energy and Commerce Committee Subcommittee on Health and the Environment, and served as the subcommittee's ranking member in 1995 and 1996. From 2009 to 2010, you were chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and since then you have been the ranking member of the committee. You also spent many years leading the House's Chief Investigatory Committee. From 1997 to 2006, you served as ranking member of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, and then you became its leader from 2007 to 2009. Legislatively, you left an extraordinary mark in 5 areas: health policy, consumer protection, environmental protection, telecommunications policy, and what I will generally call good government legislation. I, however, am going to focus my questions on the environmental part of your legacy, which includes your leadership in the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, the Safe Drinking Water amendments, laws reducing childhood lead exposure, and laws reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And in oversight, you led the effort to examine the leak by Union Carbide in Bhopal, India, which led to the enactment of the toxic right-to-know provisions of the Superfund law. And your review of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill disaster in 2010 led the way to enhanced DOI regulations, including requirements that increase corporate accountability and strengthen safety requirements for blowout preventers. For 40 years, tenacious advocacy for the environment has been your calling card. Republican Senator Alan Simpson called you tougher than a boiled owl for your persistence in passing the landmark Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. Others have called you one of the most accomplished legislators of our time. As you look back on your extraordinary career, how did you start? What led you to this area? And then, as a subpart, how did you become interested in health and environmental issues?
I always believed that government must play an important role in people's lives. It could be a force for good. That was why I decided I wanted to be in public office, because it would give me an opportunity to mold government policy that would benefit the American people. I could see no stronger argument for that than in the environmental area. Because why would any industry or any business want to spend money, millions at times, to lower the amount of their pollution if their competitors weren't doing the same thing? And there's a broader public interest. When it comes to the Clean Air Act, we're talking about an environmental law related to public health, to protect the health of the American people. We believe, and almost all Americans, I think, believe this, that we shouldn't live in a society where the elderly and the children who are most susceptible to air pollution health problems have to be living somewhere else than with the rest of us because the air is not healthy enough for them to breathe. So the whole construct of the Clean Air Act fits so well with my interest in health, which I also became interested in because, to me, I wanted to specialize in an area where I could make the most difference, because I would be a specialist and know and be deferred to as someone who is knowledgeable about these kinds of laws. And it's such a clear example of why we need government. If we didn't have government in the environmental area, if we didn't have government in the health area, the American people would lose out so much. So I've always believed that government can play a vital role, must play an essential role in helping people. And I find it so amazing when I hear people talk about shrinking government, that we don't need government. Well, I don't care how wealthy you are, where are you going to get your clean air? Where are you going to get drinking water? You could buy, I guess, through the private sector, bottled water. I know that a lot of people can go to hire private schools instead of public schools. They even hire their own private police. But they can't replace our natural resources. They can't replace the national parks, and they can't replace the beauty of nature, and they can't do anything if they just give away the air we breathe to whatever polluters want to fill it.
But you have, in fact, in your own lifetime, experienced air issues. You growing up and being Los Angeles area, which clearly had a poor air quality for many years, and now it's dramatically improved. And I want to talk to you about the role of states, particularly your state, there. So that again, increase in air quality in California, but now California has become a leader. How did that happen?
Well, California was a leader on air pollution problems before we had the Clean Air Act of 1970. And in fact, when that law was written and signed by President Nixon, they allowed California to continue down the road that they were seeking to follow with tighter car emissions and other things that they could do different than the rest of the country. California is 10% of the economy of the nation, at least. So we've always had a special role for California. But we wanted, in the adoption of the Clean Air Law in 1970, the revisions in 77, and again in 1990, to set a standard for the country. And then, once the health-based standard is set for various pollutants, then the states would play a very important role in designing the approach that would help them achieve that standard. So if you had an area like Los Angeles that was heavily polluted, it did not attain the health-based standards, but we wanted them to attain it, and we gave them time to do it, but we gave them a menu of things that they could do on their own. They had to do an inventory of the sources of pollution. We gave them tighter restrictions if it weren't for California, which had its own automobile pollution standards, but we gave for the rest of the country an idea of new cars polluting less than old cars, and as the new cars phased out the old cars, we would see a reduction over time of air pollution. I always thought, if you want clean air, you can close down the economy and stop all cars. But that didn't make sense, so we needed a strategy to reduce pollution over a period of time and let the states develop their own strategy. Now we're facing the greatest environmental challenge of our life, and that's the climate change issue. And the federal government has not yet fully acted. In the meantime, many states, especially California, but the northeastern part of the United States as well, have adopted their own laws, sometimes crossing state boundaries, to reduce the pollutants that cause climate change. Of course, it isn't one state that can solve the problem. As one state might be able to solve the problem of localized pollution, but for something like greenhouse gases, we need a worldwide approach. But until we get a worldwide approach, it doesn't mean we shouldn't do what we could where we can do it. And California has led the way with a cap and trade system, one that I thought we should have for the rest of the country, but California now has it. And other states are moving along that line as well. So states can implement the federal law because we believe every person in this country, wherever they live, should be able to breathe healthy enough air to sustain their lives. And then we have a federal standard, but states can implement it, and the states can go beyond it.
So when you achieve leadership positions, and now it's actually even before, then you are introducing legislation to improve the environment. But you're actually well known for reaching out to Republicans and drawing in bipartisan. Some of those, certainly the Clean Air Amendments in 1990 passed the House by overwhelming numbers.
Yes.
How did you do that, and who did you do it with?
People take for granted the idea we have these laws to protect them from harm, whether it's cigarette smoke in public places, which forces the non-smoker to become a smoker by breathing in secondhand smoke, or living in a city where they may not be the source of the pollution, but they're affected by the pollution itself. So what we wanted to do was to get the standard set and push for achieving what is in the common good. And I never thought these were partisan issues. These are based on health standards, based on evidence, based on science. And it was bipartisan in the beginning when the Clean Air Act was adopted in 1970. It was bipartisan in 77, but in 1982, when Reagan had become president, he proposed a law, along with John Dingell, who was the chairman, Democratic chairman of our committee, that would have allowed all the polluters to pollute a little bit more. And of course, the question had to be, well, how do you ever achieve health standards if everybody's going to pollute more? Well, they were going to let the standards be reset as not something that you had to achieve, but a goal that maybe you can meet if you want to or if you're able to. Well, that didn't make sense. And so we found Democrats and Republicans on both sides of the issue, and we stopped the Reagan-Dingell bill in 1982, but we wanted to move forward on other issues. We wanted to strengthen the clean air law for the original purpose of cleaning up the air in polluted places. We wanted to protect the areas that were not polluted, but we also wanted to deal with acid rain from sulfur emissions. We wanted to deal with toxic air pollutants, the deterioration of the upper ozone layer. We wanted to make this law more effective, and it took a period of time from 1982 to 1990 where we had to hold hearings and negotiate and reach out for partners and explain our position before we got the consensus that was established in 1990, where the law was overwhelmingly passed in the Congress on a bipartisan basis and signed by President George H.W. Bush. Now that law, if it were put on the House floor today, would probably fail. But it was overwhelmingly supported in the beginning. Right now we're living through a period in time when environmental protection has become partisan, as astounding as that is to me, and I think to most people. But we'll get through that. I think representatives will reflect the public sentiment. Well, it doesn't right now. Eventually it will, and we'll have to try to seek consensus. But people think, of course, in fact, I'll share a story with you. One of the reporters asked me after the 1990 law was passed, he said, "You were certainly going to win this fight because the American people supported you." And I thought to myself, whoa, of course they supported us. But we didn't have anything ordained that we'd come out with a strong law, because even if it were a weak law, the proponents would say it's a strong law because the American people want it. An effective, strong law that would protect their health. But oftentimes the details are what really counted, and we were able to develop the consensus and bipartisan support for not just the basic law, but the details as well.
In a second, I'll come back a little bit. I have another question on the Clean Air Act, but I have a broader question. Can there be another Henry Waxman in the future?
Absolutely. There's nothing remarkable about me. I'm a fellow who believed in government, believed we needed to protect the public health. We needed to work on a bipartisan basis to get something actually into law. What the mistake is that people think they'll come to Washington and in a couple of weeks they'll come up with a good idea and it'll pass. It just doesn't work that way. There are a lot of laws that I've authored that had strong bipartisan support, But it took years. People would look at nutrition labeling on their food and they'd say, well, of course, that makes sense. It took us years before we finally worked out a law that everybody agreed to that now empowers consumers to decide their own diets. It took years before we got the Clean Air Law established in all those different areas in 1990. It took years of keeping the issue out front and center, looking for ways to develop the consensus and alliances to actually get things done. I was able to do it because I stuck with it, and others will be able to do the same kinds of things if they stick with it and really believe in what they're doing.
Many commentators call the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 to be our most significant environmental legislation certainly our recent past. But yet you are working with a Republican administration. You had a Republican president, George H.W. Bush. You had a Republican head of EPA, Bill Riley.
Right.
How did you do that? How did you work with them? How did you accomplish, again, this extraordinary achievement?
Well, it wasn't me. They cared about these issues. President George H.W. Bush had heard a lot from the northeastern part of the country. After all, he had a home in Maine. He certainly was hearing from our friends in Canada about the acid rain and what it was doing to destroy the forests and natural resources in that area as well as in the United States. He thought there must be a way to resolve this problem, and he proposed a cap-and-trade system to use market forces to reduce the sulfur emissions that were causing the problems. He cared about the environmental issues, unlike President Reagan, who didn't seem to be aware of the issues. He seemed to think it was something that, as he might put it, tree huggers wanted, but he didn't really see it as important. I think that was just a failure for him to understand, or to have people around him that would describe it for him and the goals that we had to achieve. He did have a EPA director, Ann Gorsuch, what's her name, Burford?
Ann Gorsuch.
Ann Gorsuch, Burford, and Rita Lavelle, and they both ran into scandals. He didn't have good people around him. President Bush appointed Mr. Riley, who came out of the environmental movement. Now, what they proposed by way of legislation was not as strong as what we needed. They had a lot of proposals saying the EPA may do this, the EPA may do that. Well, we looked at it and said, well, we don't want to trust in EPA's whim. We want to set the requirements and goals and timetables, and EPA must do this and must do that. And we finally convinced enough people that that's the only way it was really going to work. We had a distrust of the EPA. We lived with the Reagan EPA, and they were the environmental destruction agency, not protecting environment. So we worked hard to develop the consensus. We were willing to compromise, and they were willing to compromise, and that led to the best possible result as I saw it.
So looking over your career, you've worked with so many different presidents, and you've worked with so many different administrators of EPA. So first, looking at the presidents during your tenure, which president had the best impact on the environment?
Well, I think it's too early to say, but I believe President Obama may well go down as the president who did the most to protect the environment, because he has such a strong commitment to the climate change question. He's working very hard to get an international agreement to reduce the greenhouse gases that have caused climate change. He proposed some far-reaching proposals, the regulations, power plants, for tighter emissions from automobiles, to get greater mileage for cars. They're looking at doing something in the area of methane, which is not a carbon, but it's a very powerful greenhouse gas that can do a tremendous amount of damage. So he's thinking along the lines of what we can do here in the United States and what we can do abroad. And he looked at Congress and he said, work with me. And just as he's seen from the first day he got into office, when he's asked Congress to work with him, it's only the Republicans, only the Democrats who want to work with him. Republicans have refused to work with them on health care, on stimulating the economy, on regulating the banks, or doing something about climate change. So he said finally, after his re-election, okay, I want Congress to work with me, but if they're not, I'll use all the tools at my disposal as President of the United States under existing laws to achieve the environmental results as far as I can. And he has a lot of tools under the Clean Air Act and other laws that will give him that power. Other presidents certainly stand high in trying to do something in the environment. I give President George H.W. Bush a lot of credit. I think that even President Nixon, I wasn't in Congress at the time, understood that an environmental protection agency was essential because the government had to do something to protect public health and the environment. So he signed the clean air laws and established the Environmental Protection Agency. So Democrats and Republicans. And if you go back, the top people in the environmental movement in the early part of the 20th century were all Republicans. It was Teddy Roosevelt who felt so strongly about environmental protections that he developed the national parks. So these are not partisan issues. Unfortunately, at this moment in time, they're being viewed as partisan. I think we're going to get beyond that, especially when we see the increasing consequences of climate change, not something in the future, not a problem down the road, but something that's happening right now, and we've got to act right now because the accumulation of these greenhouse gases in the air is threatening the only planet we live on. And why should we take that kind of a chance with the only atmosphere that we share?
So back to the Clean Air Act, 1990, leaders, good leaders, of which I've already said, I think you're at the top of that list, multitask. The good leaders are looking not only what's before them, but they're also looking at the next step. So somehow you were able to not only get this by overwhelming numbers to the House of Representatives, but also eventually bring the Senate on board. How are you doing that? Were you working with the Senate as you were putting that bill together? Were you coordinating? How did you ultimately accomplish the entirety of that bill before it went to President Bush for signature?
Well, I don't want to take credit for everything. We did have Senator Mitchell as a great leader in the Senate to protect the environment. We had Republican chairs of the committee in the Senate, Senator Stafford, Senator Chafee, who are strong environmentalists. We've had allies and partners. In the House of Representatives, two of my strongest allies were Republicans, Congressman Sherry Bollard and Congressman Jerry Lewis from California. Bollard from New York and Jerry Lewis from California. So we had bipartisan support, but the Senate was moving independently. And for example, it was Senator Chafee who proposed doing something about deterioration of the upper ozone layer. We came in with a stronger provision in the area of reducing emissions that cause air pollution problems right locally that have severe health problems, cause severe health problems. Well, we took their section on the upper ozone. They took our section on reducing the air pollution, the urban air pollution. We worked back and forth because the leaders in both the House and the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, wanted a strong law. And while I was in a fight with Chairman John Dingell in the beginning of the process, by the time we got through in the House, he was a strong supporter of the bill as well. So we had to compromise, we had to work hard, we had to bring people along, and eventually, not overnight, but eventually we got there with strong leadership in the House and the Senate, and leadership from the Bush administration in 1990 as well.
I recognize that asking you a question about what you might be proudest of, or among all of your legislation, might be like picking among children, of which I know you have both children and grandchildren. Yeah. But I would like you to, I have to ask the question, is there something there that stands out in your own mind as something I am particularly proud of in those legislative, your many legislative accomplishments?
I can't single out any one. I'm very proud of the Clean Air Act. I was delighted we got a safe drinking water law. We got it at a time when we were in the minority because Republicans had closed down the government under Newt Gingrich. And then they were looking for accomplishments in 1996, and we said, fine, We'll give you accomplishments if it's a real strong, good law, but we're not going to give you an accomplishment just so you can go to the people and say you did something when you didn't. So we got that law passed. We knew the danger to children, especially of lead. And so we had stopped the lead in the automobiles, but we had to also deal with lead in paint in a lot of the older buildings. So in the environmental area, I'm very proud of the work we've done. But in the health area, to finally have the great accomplishment of the Affordable Care Act, where it allows every American to buy health insurance, many of whom had been excluded from that possibility because they couldn't get an insurance company that would sell them a policy if they had pre-existing medical conditions. That, to me, was a great accomplishment as well. And then I did the law on generic drugs to compete and lower the prices for drugs for the consumers. The Orphan Drug Act, which encouraged more development of drugs for small patient populations with rare diseases. The HIV/AIDS issue, which came about because I was chairman of the committee when the AIDS epidemic started. We didn't even call it AIDS, but we knew that gay men particularly were coming down with a rare cancer. We held hearing after hearing after hearing, promoted more money for research, and eventually adopted the Ryan White Act. And then one of the areas that I'm very proud of is the anti-tobacco efforts, because we had known since the 1950s that cigarette smoking causes cancer and other diseases. We weren't able to do anything about it until we had a hearing with those executives from the tobacco companies who raised their hand and said they're going to tell us the truth, but then said, cigarettes, they don't cause any problems. It's coincidental that people get heart disease and cancer and die from when they smoke, but it's just coincidental. Nicotine is not even addictive. Just that hearing alone, I think, changed the public attitude about tobacco. And then eventually we got the law that gave the Food and Drug Administration authority to regulate tobacco products. Only product around that was completely unregulated, even though it's the only product that's legally sold, that when it's used as intended, kills people. So I'm proud of all of these things, and then there are a lot of small things as well that I know make a difference. Again, my philosophy, government can make a difference. Government is essential to help people and to be for the public interest. We have a lot of special interests, but we need to recognize that there's a broad public interest as well.
Some people writing about your career have said that notwithstanding the legislative accomplishments, it may well actually be more important what you did in your oversight role, the spotlight that you're able to shine on different issues. How did you get involved? How did you do that? How did you see your role in doing congressional oversight? And then the same question, were you doing that with Republicans too?
A lot of people think of Congress legislating. The other job that we have is oversight, to see whether the laws are working, whether we need to change them, whether we need to eliminate them, whether it's meeting the needs that we have in this country. And so I think in many ways doing oversight and investigations is more important than legislation. When we had the hearing with the tobacco executives, it was in the committee that had legislative jurisdiction, but it was an oversight hearing to find out how the tobacco industry was responding to the growing awareness that we were all getting, that they could manipulate the nicotine to keep people smoking, that they were targeting kids to get them to start smoking at an age when they were legally unable to buy the cigarettes because they were 13, 14 years of age, and no state allowed them to buy cigarettes before 18. And yet, the executives, as we later learned, sat down in these board meetings and said, how can we get kids to start smoking our brand? Because if they start smoking our brand, they'll be loyal for the rest of their lives, even if their lives may be shortened. They didn't seem concerned about that. So oversight draws attention to problems. Sometimes simply drawing attention to a problem can have an enormous impact. Sometimes drawing attention to a problem can lead to legislation. And that's what oversight and investigation should be all about, not the partisan stuff that we see where the committee will look for things to blame President Obama because they don't like President Obama, so they want to blame him for the terrible tragedy in
Benghazi.
Republicans want to blame President Obama for the terrible tragedy that happened in Benghazi, Libya, even though it was the terrorists that acted. And report after report has come out and said, yeah, it's terrorists. The administration did everything they could. Oversight and investigations should not be for partisan purposes. It ought to be to learn something. It ought to be to educate the people, and then to see if legislation is needed.
But you were in a majority role and you were in a minority role.
Yeah.
You were in charge, but you also at some stages were not. Were you able to work with Republicans doing that investigatory oversight that we've been talking about?
Sometimes, and sometimes not. In the committee of jurisdiction, the health committee, we were looking at the AIDS epidemic, and the top Republican was a man by the name of Bill Dannemeyer. And Bill Dannemeyer was so extreme that he didn't want to approach it as a health issue. He wanted to approach it as a way to go after people who were gay, after men who were gay. And he didn't want us to even talk about sexual transmission of the disease, because that would certainly encourage people to have sex, or talk about the use of needles for using drugs, because that would only encourage people to use drugs, as if they needed encouragement by pointing out this is how the disease was transmitted and how we ought to tackle that problem right head on. And this was at a time when if you had AIDS and you were a gay man, you could lose your job, you could lose your health insurance, you could lose everything. There were no protections of privacy, there were no protections from discrimination, and what was even worse, you were facing a disease at the beginning that inevitably killed you in a very short period of time. We've come a long way since then. But that was an example of a Republican that I couldn't work with. I was able to work with the Republicans in the Department of Health and Human Services because they understood it from a health perspective. And one of the great leaders in this effort was Dr. C. Everett Koop. So we worked with him. But on the environmental issues, we've had Republicans we've been able to work with. On the investigations, in the investigative committee, Congressman Tom Davis, who became chairman, was willing to look at issues that when we pressed him on it, and he said, you're right, we ought to look at the waste of taxpayers' dollars in contracts where the government was being played, where there was not competition for a government contract. It would be a sole source contract to a company like Halliburton. It wasn't particularly the best qualified to take on the job, and yet they would be paid millions of dollars on maybe billions, on a cost-plus contract where they had every incentive to keep adding costs. And we worked with Chairman Tom Davis. I can't remember when we were the majority, when we were the minority, but we worked together on oversight hearings because he appreciated the importance of the institution doing this important job. So I've had Democrats and Republican co-chairs or ranking or chairman that I could work with, and others that I had to go around. But if they're not cooperating, you just keep pushing forward and getting other people to weigh in, trying to educate the American people and my colleagues to do what made sense.
Congressman, you've spent your life now filling in the gaps, creating a body of environmental law that is actually not just for the United States, it's actually a model for the world. But as you look at that, are there shortcomings? Are there things that you think we should in fact be thinking about as a nation?
The issues are never finally resolved. You have to keep learning, oversight, investigations, evaluations of how the law is working lead you to realizing there are other things to do. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to pass legislation to deal with the climate change issue. In 2009, with the support of President Obama, we passed through the House of Representatives the Waxman-Markey bill that set in place an economy-wide limit on pollution that causes climate change and a trading system that would make it as cost-effective as possible. We had a lot of support from the business community. In fact, it came out of a project where the CEOs of some of the major corporations and the CEOs of the environmental groups worked together on the Climate Action Partnership. And we took that as the basis for our legislation. What I didn't realize is that the Republicans weren't interested in what the business community had to say at that point in time. They were listening to their ideologues who said, climate change? What climate change? There's no such thing. Science? Oh, we don't believe science. That's just another political point of view, not something that's based on evidence and reality. So I would have liked to have seen that bill become law, but it didn't, and we then have to keep moving forward. And luckily, President Obama is moving forward, I think, in a very strong and effective way, using existing law and directing people within his administration to get tighter standards for automobiles on fuel efficiency, dealing with the power plant, which is the leading source of carbon emissions, through regulations that will deal with that problem, and try to get greater efficiency in the use of energy, which can save us the need to build some of these power plants that pollute so much. And the economy is moving, but it would certainly move faster and more effectively if we gave it all the right incentives for a clearer direction. But we are moving in the right way.
All right, same question on your just extraordinary career, looking at what happened. Of course, Congress creates the laws, but the executive branch implements all of them. So you've seen the Environmental Protection Agency almost from its birth to where it is right now. How's that going?
Well, the Environmental Protection Agency has had its ups and downs. We knew, despite some of the early strong leaders of the EPA, that under President Reagan, the leadership, and under President George W. Bush, the leadership at the EPA was not as interested and as forceful in enforcing the law. For example, the Supreme Court reached a decision that said that carbon pollution, which causes greenhouse gases and climate change, must be regulated if there's a finding by EPA that it's a threat to public health and the environment. Well, EPA, under President George W. Bush, made that finding. It was hard for them not to make that finding based on the evidence. Once they made that finding, they had to move forward. So when they sent the finding to the White House refused to open up the envelope. They didn't want to know what EPA had found because they did not want to regulate to deal with this problem. That was certainly not a high point for the EPA. Now we have an EPA that's being much more active in trying to protect the public interest, and I'm very proud of the work they're doing in the power plant rule and in other areas. So we have an EPA that's trying to live up to what the American people want from the EPA. So you have leaders sometimes who really care and want to do the right thing, and sometimes you have leaders who just become political and want to help out their party to raise more money and to appease the fossil fuel industry without recognizing the broader public interest of trying to achieve both strengthening the economy, creating more jobs, and protecting the environment as well, which can be done together, even though we hear people say, oh, you have to make a choice. It's not a choice. And the history of the Clean Air Law shows that we didn't have to make that choice. We've achieved enormous reductions in threatening pollution. At the same time, the economy has grown, more motor vehicles on the road, and more people working than ever before.
Congressman, are there things in our future in the health or environmental arena that worry you?
No question about it. The climate change issue is very, very frightening. I thought a good point was made when someone said, even if you don't believe in all the dire threats and fears that might come about from climate change, if there's a 10% chance it's going to happen, would you be willing to take that kind of a gamble? A 10% chance that we would destroy the atmosphere that sustains life? So just to be prudent and to move the economy in a way that will, I think, be a dramatic step forward for jobs and a more profitable world, we ought to be doing a lot of the things that people have told us we need to do to transform our economy from solely fossil fuels to alternatives and efficiency that will not cause this threat to the environment. There may be other threats. We may not know about them, but we've got to be open to learning. We've got to be open to responding. We have to be open to different ideas and be open to each other, because these are not partisan issues. These are issues often of life and death, or the quality of life, and I don't care if you're a Democrat, or Republican, or socialist, or whatever, or libertarian even. Libertarians don't have a solution if they just say, do it on your own, unless you give the right economic incentives for the free market to work to accomplish the goal that we all want to achieve.
My last question of you, which I have to ask, largely because of who you are as one of the leaders of the world that I live in, and someone that many of us deeply admire, I have to ask your view about the future. You're leaving Congress with a breathtaking record, but with points like greenhouse gas that are still yet left open. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about our future? And don't stop there. Whatever you answer, why? Why do you fall on one side or the other?
Well, I'm basically an optimist. I don't believe in just giving up. If you care about things, you have to be willing to fight for them. Not just make a speech somewhere about you wish things were better, how because we haven't accomplished goals, it must be those people in power are not doing what they should be. Let's forget about it all. If you care about these issues, you've got to be there and fight, whether you're in public office or a citizen, an activist, a business person, whatever it is, we've got to fight for the common good. So I still believe that there's a lot we can do. I still believe that government is the major way we can accomplish these goals. And we have ups and downs, but what we need are people who will stay with it and fight for it any way they can. And I think that's basically what the American people believe in as well. So I have to think that we'll muddle through at times, but we'll get there.
Congressman, as you well know, the Environmental Law Institute gave its annual award this year to the state of California,
Yes.
and to Mary Nichols. When
Mm-hmm.
I asked Mary Nichols if there were, if she had a choice of anybody that could introduce her, she said Congressman Henry Waxman would be the person that I would most like,
Mm-hmm.
and you were good enough to do that. As we gather to think about having you there and introducing her at what turned out to be a wonderful dinner evening. All of us at the Environmental Law Institute, which is Republicans and Democrats and every other parties of whether you can think of, all thought, well, we need to say something about you. And as you know, we gave you then, and I'm giving to you now the artistic version, but it says Henry Waxman, our superhero for environment, health, and safety, and we had that as a cover of what we had. But I hope you felt, as an attorney, I hope you could feel the jury. There was a jury of your peers, almost 750 people out there, and I hope you could feel their affection. I hope you could feel them honoring you with their applause that they gave you, but also because of what you meant to the country. There are people alive now that would not have been alive but for what you have accomplished. There's people who are going into careers now that would not have done that but for your leadership. We do not believe at the Environmental Law Institute that you're ending your career. We just believe you're moving into another arena.
Right.
And we hope to see you as the advocate that you have been your entire life for those issues that we cherish and for your importance to the country. So on behalf of all of us that we represent, our thousands of members, we thank you for your service.
Thank you.
We also thank you for sharing with us your extraordinary career and your advice as to how others and future generations can continue on the Henry Waxman path to success. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
That's it.
Okay.
We try to stay on